right, good morning. Let me give another shout out to everyone from Lakeview kids and junior high who are joining us this summer. Who's pumped that school's out for summer? Kids, you'll have to ask your parents later who Alice Cooper is and why he's on the screen. Or let's be honest, you probably need to ask your grandparents. So I know that some of you and kids and youth, you're probably a little bit bummed that kids in junior high isn't happening because let's be honest, Kim and Dallin and our incredible team of volunteers here at Lakeview, they do amazing work running Lakeview kids in junior high. So I'm glad that you all love being in kids and junior high on Sundays, but can I just say that selfishly, I love it when you join us for the summer. My own kids are among you. My daughter, Penny, just finished grade 4, and Theo finished grade 6. And I love when they and all the rest of you join us for the summer. I love when you sing loud. I really like it when you laugh at my jokes. Okay, keep that in mind. And I just consider it really great that we get to do all the stuff of church together. So to everyone here, from kids, junior high, those who are new, those who are married, those who are not married, all of you, welcome here. It's just so a joy to do this together. But I also just want to recognize that those who are joining us from kids especially, you're not usually in this room, right? Or if you're in junior high, you usually kind of dip out when it comes time for the teaching. So let me catch you up to speed a little bit. First off, my name is Curtis. I'm one of the pastors here at Lakeview. And our lead pastor, Paul, usually handles most of the teachings on Sundays. But during the summer, we actually invite a bunch of friends to help teach us, which is great. So next week, my friend Santosh will be teaching. Later in the summer, David, who's usually doing music, he's going to take a turn preaching. Dallin will be up here, along with other friends like Carissa, Jared, and Pastor Darlene. And our teaching series for the summer is called Against the Grain. And we're exploring the parables of Jesus. Now, before we dive into this morning's teaching, let's just start by locating together where the parables of Jesus are found in our Bibles. So, first off, there are kind of two main halves to our Bibles, right? The Old Testament, which is often called the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament. So simple question for those of you, and I invite you to shout it out. Which half of the Bible are we going to find the parables? Anybody know? New Testament. Nicely done. I got a keener in the group. That's great. So when you look at the New Testament, you can actually break it down into a bunch of different sections for kind of books that are similar that are grouped together. So there's the Gospels, there's the book of Acts, Paul's letters, the general letters, and Revelation. So now, among these different sections, where are we going to find the parables? Anybody know? Gospels. We've got a keener group today. This is great. All right. Now, there are 4 Gospels. Can we name them together? Anybody know? Nicely done. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's really good. So each of these gentlemen wrote biographies about the life of Jesus. And today we're going to be looking at the book of Matthew. So if you have a copy of the Bible with you, or if you have a device where you can access the Bible app, you can open it up to Matthew chapter 13. And I invite you to literally do that. And we're going to start in verse 24 of Matthew 13. And then as you turn there, you may notice that there are heading sections in different parts of the Bible, and there's sometimes these section breaks. Now, those headings, they were not a part of the original version of Matthew's gospel. And actually, a lot of the stuff that we're used to in our Bibles, like chapter divisions and even verses, those weren't part of the original writings. Those are there to help guide us through and orient ourselves to the Bible. So if you're looking at Matthew 13, verse 24, you may see a heading in your Bible. Does anybody see a heading and you'd be willing to shout it out for us? What do you see? Parable of the weeds. Great. Anybody have a different, does it say something different in yours? Parable of the wheat and weeds. I heard parable of the sower, perhaps. So, yeah, depending on the translation you're reading in, you may see these different things. So, but it's helpful to understand, today we're talking about a parable about wheat and weeds. Now, before we get into this parable, it would be helpful to answer a simple question, which is, what is a parable? Well, quite simply, a parable is a story. But it's not like the kind of story that your friends might be sharing during recess. You know, like those stories where your buddy is like, yo, the other day I was like biking by the river and I was like ripping so fast. Like, no, you don't understand. Like I was like flying on my bike by the river and I got going so fast, I got so scared. I thought I was gonna like fly into the river, but then like I didn't. And it was scary. And you're like, cool story, bro. Yeah, parables, they're not like that, okay? You see, Jesus was a master teacher, and he would often make up a story, but it was able to hold deep truth. And parables, they're like truth in pictures, in images. And Jesus told a variety of parables, and we're gonna be exploring those throughout the summer. And no matter how different each parable is, the goal is consistent. The goal of the stories is to help us understand who we are to become and to understand what kind of God is. And parables, they're not cute little fables with moral lessons. They're actually disruptive. They're intended to persuade us to think differently about God. And Jesus tells these kind of stories to kind of keep us off balance, to keep us from getting lazy in our faith, to keep us from this sense of pride that makes us feel like we kind of already know all there is to know. We've already learned it all, right? In kids in junior high and on Sunday mornings. The parables press in on that. And they press in to say there's more to understand and to experience of who God is. The parables of Jesus, they push us to not settle, to be curious about who we can become, and to help imagine to the best of our ability the kind of God that God truly is. And the parables, they show us truth in the form of a picture so that we can kind of begin to understand, but they're meant to draw us in. Parables aren't meant to resolve everything. They're meant to kind of poke at us so that these ideas and these images, they swirl around in our minds and they keep us thinking deeply about who God is. And we've already encountered a parable about farming and gardening already, right? You may remember this. Paul walked us through the beginning of Matthew 13, which is often called the parable of the farmer scattering seed. And it seems like Jesus really liked images from everyday life. And it turns out that Jesus lived among people who understood farming, which is cool for us living in Saskatchewan, because like we know wheat, don't we? So this parable should hopefully connect with us. So let's take a look at what the parable has to say. Jesus told him another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Okay, so how many of you in the room are gardeners or maybe like helper gardeners? You put your hands in the dirt every now and then. Okay, so anybody else hearing this and you're kind of scratching your head because you're like, we have wheat in Saskatchewan and we've also got weeds. And we pull weeds, don't we, right? Like, I've gathered some images from weeds that grow in Saskatchewan, and I've actually put it together in a little trivia game for you to see if you know the names of these weeds. So, does anybody know what this is called? Dandelion, very good. We know that one, right? It is a weed, even though we often think they look pretty, but parents know they are weeds for sure. How about this one? Does anybody know the name of this weed? Purslane, did you know that? You just knew that? It wasn't a guess? Wow, that's impressive, Donald. I did not know that, but the internet tells me so. Or how about this pesky one that grows in my back alley? Anybody know the name of this weed? It's a tough one. Those are all names of real weeds, by the way. That thing is called prostrate knotweed. And then last one, who's seen these ones around? Do you know what it's called? Nodding thistle, I think I heard it. Nicely done. So, the point is, it's weird, right? Because this farmer is saying, don't pull the weeds because you might rip out the wheat with the weeds, which is weird because you have to be a pretty bad farmer to mix up these kind of weeds with wheat, right? Except, how many of you recognize that this is not a picture of wheat? Did anybody notice that? This is a weed called poison darnel. And this is likely the kind of tare or weed that Jesus was referring to in his parable. Makes you think a little bit differently about ripping out the weeds and the wheat when you picture this growing alongside wheat, right? So, okay, we have someone who has planted wheat, and an enemy has planted this false wheat among the good wheat. And the master tells his workers to leave the weeds to grow among the wheat until the harvest, because at that time, the weeds and the wheat can be sorted. And when Jesus tells parables, we don't always get an explanation. Sometimes we're just left to chew on what the image is trying to tell us. But in this case, his followers, they ask him for the meaning of the story. So if you jump down to verse 36, then he left the crowd and went into the house. And his disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man." That's Jesus. "The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear." Whoa, that got intense, right? Anybody feeling uncomfortable? I do. So you can feel uncomfortable for me if you like. This is the kind of stuff that churns my stomach a little bit, right? And we might be tempted to avoid these kind of challenging messages, but it's important that we face into them. Jesus wants to speak to us. He wants us to understand the eternal implications of his message. If we have ears, we should listen. And it's also important that we process what Jesus is saying properly. First off, back at the beginning of this parable, Jesus said, "This is what the kingdom of heaven is like." And when we talk about the kingdom of heaven, it's important that we have the right image on our brain. Usually, when people talk about heaven, we're used to picturing some kind of place beyond the clouds where one day we will play harps and enjoy this blissful life with God. But we must remember what Jesus said about the kingdom of heaven. And back at the beginning of his ministry in Matthew 4, it says, "From that time, Jesus began to preach, saying, 'Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.'" Jesus says that he has brought heaven near. Heaven is taking ground here on earth. This is very important because if you pay attention to the whole story of the Bible, you can understand what is meant by heaven. Because we're used to talking about heaven and hell as the two kind of ultimate realities of God's story. But if you notice, in the opening lines of the Bible, it says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Not heaven and hell, but heaven and earth. And what we come to understand is that heaven, it's not so much a place you go when you die, but it represents God's space, where God dwells. And earth represents human space, where humans dwell. And if you head over to BibleProject.com, they have this fantastic video on heaven and earth that I highly recommend you watch when you get home. And if you read the story of creation, you will see that heaven and earth were meant to overlap. The Garden of Eden was a place where God's space overlapped with human space. But if you read further, you will come to see that sin enters into the story and the humans are unable to remain in God's heavenly space. So heaven and earth are divided. But the union of heaven and earth is what the story of the Bible is all about. When Jesus declared that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, he was declaring that the reunion of heaven and earth was happening. The kingdom of heaven is taking ground on earth. But in the parable of the weeds and the wheat, Jesus tells us that not all is well in the kingdom. There is an enemy who's working against the purposes of God. Now, did you notice that the weeds, they're not the enemy? There is an enemy who's cultivating evil, turning people against the ways of God. And the weeds, they represent people who have given in to the ways of the enemy. And the workers, they want to yank those people out, rip them up, get them out of here. They don't belong among the good wheat. And you know what I mean when we hear that, right? They don't belong with us. And we know how to identify weeds in our world, don't we? We know the kind of people who are living in ways that are evil, ways that are opposed to God, ways that are opposed to us. The good wheat, right? Because that's how we often read these kind of stories, isn't it? There are good people and there are bad people. And one day they're both going to get what's coming to them, and that's too bad for the bad folks. Good thing, I'm one of the good ones. But this is exactly the kind of instinct that this parable is trying to press against. We are not called to do the work of sorting wheat and weeds. In fact, if you read this parable closely, you'll recognize this parable isn't telling us much about what we are supposed to do. This parable, it's inviting us to locate ourselves in God's story, a story where, unfortunately, joy and sorrow live side by side. And sometimes we have a very hard time accepting the pain of life. Why are there weeds in this world? Why is there hardship? Why are people starving? Why are people marginalized? Why do some people seem to have it easy while others suffer? Why is there violence in the world, greed, selfishness? An enemy has done this. You see, in the garden, there was a snake who convinced the humans to question God and to not trust God's ways. And the snaky enemy continues to be at work in our world. But this is not simply a problem out there. This is a problem in here. And this is why we cannot take it upon ourselves to judge wheat from weeds, because the weeds grow in my life as much as they do in yours. But this is ultimately not a story about weeds. This is a story about a good gardener. Jesus is actively sowing good seed in our broken world. By his Spirit, he is growing good fruit of righteousness and justice. So we do not look out at all the corruption and brokenness and despair and hopelessness. That's not the whole story we see. We trust that the good gardener is at work in our lives, helping us to grow into good wheat with lives producing the fruit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And while we are called not to judge and try to sort wheat from weeds, we can also trust that evil will be dealt with. One day, there will be judgment, and the weeds will be separated from the wheat. And this is where I need to point out that Jesus is making use of metaphors to describe the judgment against evil. And those metaphors, they reveal that Jesus is serious about sin and wickedness. But they are metaphors, which means, like again, Jesus is using pictures to reveal something true. And to help us understand the way that metaphors work, let me compare this teaching with another time that Jesus talked about judgment. In Matthew 8, he says that the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. You compare that with what we read in Matthew 13, that they will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, which one is it? Will ultimate judgment be defined by darkness or a blazing fire? See, the image of darkness, it speaks to separation, to isolation, disconnection from God, who is the true light. But the image of the blazing furnace, it's an image of refinement, where metals were melted down in order to remove the imperfections. It speaks of the destruction of evil and wickedness. And these are pictures that Jesus is using to describe something true. They're not literal descriptions. And while this can still feel quite heavy and uncomfortable, we need to ask ourselves, do we trust that God is a good sorter? Because we've already learned that we are not meant to try and sort weeds from weeds, because we will certainly mess things up, as the history of the church shows again and again. Whenever the church has taken upon itself to do the sorting, it doesn't go well. But do you trust Jesus to act as a wise judge? Do you believe he is capable of sorting out the judgment over evil? And when you picture this kind of cosmic judgment that Jesus is speaking of, what image of God do you hold in your imagination? Colossians tells us that the Son is the image of the invisible God. Hebrews says that the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of God's being. So, what image of God do you hold in your mind's eye? Is it Jesus, who kneels at the side of the woman caught in adultery? Is it Jesus, who ate with the despised in culture? Is it Jesus who touched the sick and restored their health and dignity? Is it Jesus who prayed for those who killed him? See, the cross of Jesus is our reminder of how Jesus confronted evil. He allowed evil to do its worst to him. He freely handed over his life and submitted to the actions of people who had given in to the work of the enemy. Jesus knew that those who killed him were not his true enemies. We do not battle against flesh and blood, but against rulers and principalities of darkness. And at the cross, Jesus waged battle against the enemy of darkness. But he did not play by the enemy's ways. Jesus revealed that it is perfect love that conquers darkness. His death is our reference point for how Jesus confronts evil. We trust our lives with this God, with this one who confronts evil in this way, who says that because of the cross, we can be forgiven. So we do not fear judgment of God because we have heard the voice of the one who declares, "Come to me all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest." We do not hide from God in fear. We're not afraid of God's judgment for the ways weeds have taken hold in our lives. We do not read these words and find ourselves scared and worried. Where will I be tossed out one day? Will I be among the weeds? We can look to Jesus and the cross and say, there is hope. I have no reason to fear. We trust in the hope that if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just and forgives us our sins and cleanses us from all unrighteousness. We acknowledge our need for God to save us and to heal us and restore us. How would we ever cast judgment on others when we are aware of all the ways we've fallen short? But we don't hang our heads in defeat. We look to the cross and we remember that Jesus gives us life. And this parable tells us that we will shine like the sun in the kingdom of our Father. So there are parts of this parable that probably still rest uneasy with us. The idea of darkness, blazing furnace, weeping of gnashing of teeth will never sit well in my soul. But amidst that reality, I know what the judge is like. I know what Jesus is like, and I trust the love of Jesus to sort things out regarding good and evil in God's good ways.